Yeah, we spent 3 weeks in a canoe on the upper part. We started in July of 2002, and then the plan was to be in the Gulf of Mexico by about Halloween. So we planned for it to be a 3 month trip, and it took 16 years.
From the river to the valley to the sea. All the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 38 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. In this episode, I talk with Trapper Haskins about his forthcoming book, Crooked Old River, in which he describes his experience rowing the length of the Mississippi in a boat he built himself. Now, there are a lot of books about river trips like this, many of which were, let's say, fairly mediocre. But Trapper's book really stands out as one of the better books in this genre, and really just a pleasant read in general. So in this interview, we talk about his childhood experiences with the Mississippi, growing up in Memphis, how he got interested in boat building and the idea that sparked an interest in rowing down the Mississippi, how he and his wife, who rowed with him, prepared for the trip, his love of history and how that added to the experience of spending so much time along the river, the circumstances around ending their trip early in 2002, and then the decision to go back to the river many years later. So Trapper also spent some time talking about how the river trip changed him personally, and how traveling on a river can encourage introspection and reflection. Trapper is a good storyteller, which is something you quickly learn when you read his book or listen to his music, and I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to this interview too. I sure enjoyed the conversation with him. As usual, you'll find the show notes at MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast. Thanks to all of you who continue to show me some love through Patreon. Your support keeps this podcast going and inspires me every day. If Patreon isn't your thing, hey, buy me a coffee. I'm a regular coffee drinker, and I appreciate every little bit of support. Curious how to do that? Go to MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, and you'll find instructions there. And now, on with the interview. A deckhand and a dishwasher, a shipwright and house carpenter, a street musician and cubicle dweller, Trapper Haskins has earned his keep in myriad ways since leaving school in his hometown of Memphis more than 20 years ago. Today, he and his family live in Thompson Station, Tennessee, where he works as a furniture maker, finish carpenter, and freelance writer. His writing has appeared in Sports Illustrated, Wooden Boat, and American Songwriter. And we are here today to talk about his new book, Crooked Old River, about his source to sea trip down the Mississippi in a rowboat. Welcome to the podcast, Trapper.
Thanks for having me. Honored to be here.
I have one very important question to start us off with, and that is, when was the last time you ate an open-faced peanut butter and hot sauce sandwich?
I have not had one since the river trip. We overdosed on those. But
So did it matter what kind of hot sauce you used for that, or
what did we have? We had Valentina's hot sauce.
oh yeah.
Valentina's hot sauce, crunchy peanut butter, and then just white bread that's just sort of been allowed to sit in the sun and get warm.
That sounded like one of the more creative dietary choices I've come across for river trips, so I may have to stash that idea away for a future trip of my own.
Yeah, it's easy to pack away and carry, and as long as you can keep the bread from going moldy, it'll that's a snack that will last.
So you grew up in Memphis. I'm just kind of wondering, when you were growing up, like what was the Mississippi River of your childhood like?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Memphis. Neither of my parents worked anywhere near the river. My mother was a school teacher and my dad was an insurance guy, so we didn't really go down and visit the river too often. But there is a park that's downtown Memphis called Mud Island, where there's a scale model of the Mississippi River, and we would go down there in the summertime. And I'm sure you've been there, but the park is situated right next to the Mississippi River. And so you've got this 2,000 foot scale model of the lower Mississippi River just adjacent to the actual Mississippi River. And that was what sort of sparked my imagination and sort of led me to falling in love with the river. But, as a kid, we were warned not to go anywhere near the actual river because any kid in Memphis knows it's dangerous and you'll slip in and the whirlpools will take you and all sorts of terrifying things. So we didn't go near or in the actual river.
So it's interesting, given what you ended up doing a few years later, but like in spite of this, scale model, you really had this image of the Mississippi as a big scary beast, essentially.
Yeah, we did. And then of course, in school you're reading Mark Twain, you're reading Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and all that kind of stuff. And so there, even though it's this scary thing, there was this those books sort of invited you, I think, to come closer to the river. And some of those early Disney movies with Fink and those, you've seen the keelboat guy, all that romanticism of the river. Even as a kid, your parents sort of scare you off of the river, but those sort of things invite you to get a little closer to it. And it just sort of gets in your mind.
Absolutely. I remember, I don't know how old I was, maybe 12 or so. There was a local theater playing Tom Sawyer, a Hollywood make, the typical sort of Disney version of Tom Sawyer. And this was at a time when they weren't real strict about checking movie tickets. So we were able to sit through the movie a second time.
Okay.
But I do remember like just watching that movie. It seemed like such a romantic thing to be on a raft floating down the river. I think a lot of the other details about the story were kind of lost on me at that age, but
Same. Yeah. It was just that image of the just the freedom of it. You were just on your own little boat drifting down the river. And so we used to visit this place, Mud Island, where they had this scale model. And I clearly remember being a kid of about 8 years old at the snack bar getting a popsicle, and we'd eat the popsicle up and down the model of the river. And the kids we would drop our popsicle stick in the river, and then we would just follow it down because this is, it's a quarter of a mile bathymetric chart of the river, and there's water flowing through this model. So it's sort of this, it's like a living sculpture. There's a million gallons of water flowing through this scale model of the river. And so we would drop our popsicle sticks in there and just sort of pretend that that was Huck Finn's raft or whatever. And we would follow it all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, because this Mud Island River Park starts at Cairo, Illinois. And 4/10 of a mile later, you're at this large public swimming pool, which is the Gulf of Mexico. And so, over the course of a couple of thousand steps, you could go from Cairo to the Gulf and follow your own little raft all the way to the wide open sea. And so that was I did that over and over again as a kid.
well, that sounds fun. I think Mud Island is maybe in a little bit of a transitional state today, but that's for another day. I know they're trying to figure out a future for that area, and it needs a little bit of love and care, I think, right now.
Yeah, my understanding they're doing a renovation right now. I think they're in the middle of that renovation. So I don't know how visitor friendly it is at the moment, but
So, were there any times when you were a kid when you went on the river?
the first time I remember going actually on the river would have been when I was in college. I went to Mud Island to try and get a job get a summer job. And they hired me on the spot, and I was excited because here I was going to I was going to get to be like a tour guide at this place that sort of was sort of the whatever the cradle of my sort of ideas about the Mississippi. And then when I found out it was minimum wage and they were part-time hours, I quickly decided not to take that job. And then on the way back home, I stopped by the Memphis Queen Line, I think is the name of it, where they have the Island Queen, the Memphis Queen. There's a couple of different riverboats or sightseeing riverboats. And I got hired as a deckhand on one of those. And so I think that would have been my first time on the river, would have been as a deckhand on one of those sightseeing riverboats. And
Wow.
that was an eye-opening experience for me, being a kid who, loved the river, loved the history of the river, and whose only experience with it had been this model of it. Now here I am out on the real thing as a deckhand, I was a paid riverman, and so it was sort of, it felt like a step up for me. So that would have been the first time that I actually got on the river. And that would have been the last time I was on the river until my wife and I took the rowboat trip. So the only
Wow.
time I've been on the river before our trip was as a deckhand for a summer in
But
Memphis. Yeah.
you said it was eye-opening. How so?
Well, when you drive across the bridge, any of the bridges, it's a big river, but you can't really grasp how big the thing really is until you're in the middle of it and you're looking from one bank to the other. And that's when you realize this thing is massive. It is absolutely enormous. And I mean, it's unnerving as a first timer on the boat. It can be unnerving on a riverboat. And so you think of anybody in a canoe, a kayak, or a rowboat, it's a dauntingly large river. So
Absolutely. Yeah, especially from that perspective of those smaller boats.
yes, yeah,
Uh, so at some point then in your young adulthood, you got interested in boats, interested enough to move out to Maine to learn how to be a boat builder. So tell us a little bit about that period,
yeah,
like how you got interested in boats and boat building.
yeah. After that summer job on the river boats, I wanted to stay with boats. So I was an English major at the University of Memphis, or Memphis State at the time when I was going there in the '90s. And I got a job at a local boat yard. They had fiberglass sailboats there. A friend of mine's dad bought a sailboat, so I got to go out on one of the local lakes around Memphis, and it was fun. I enjoyed it, and I wanted to stick with it. And I was working in this fiberglass yard, and I was learning to repair and refurbish old fiberglass boats. But there's always been something in me, and maybe it comes from the days at Mud Island, where I've always sort of loved anything that I get interested in, I sort of get attached to the history of that thing. And so, for instance, locally here in Nashville, where I live, I love baseball. And so I play in a vintage baseball league. We play by the rules of 1864. So it's Civil War era baseball. And that has been the story time and time again with me. Anything that I fall in love with, or anything that I have a passing interest in, I just sort of like to chase the history of it. And so when I got interested in sailboats, the history is invariably going to lead you to New England on all the wooden boat yards up there. And being an English major at Memphis State, I had come to the realization that I didn't want to be an English teacher. I didn't want to be an academic. I didn't want to be indoors. And so I decided that I would like to learn how to build wooden boats. It was, I was 21, 22 years old, dropped out of college and got married to my sweetheart. And 2 weeks after the wedding, we packed up a Ryder truck and moved up to Rockland, Maine, where I went to the apprentice shop, which is a 2-year apprenticeship learning to build lobster boats, sailboats, rowboats, all plank on frame in the traditional fashion. So that was in 2000. We moved up there to do that.
Well, that's a good way to test a marriage right out of the gate, huh?
That's
And it
I
gets
think
better from here.
yeah,
So,
yeah. I think her parents probably had some questions around that time that we actually decided to do that. But while I was there, one winter night I was in the library. So the school there has a library, and there was a book called American Small Sailing Craft by Howard Chappell. and they were work boats from East Coast fishing boats, West Coast, Gulf Coast scow schooners and stuff like that. And on one of the pages, I turned the page and there was a Mississippi River yawl. And this was an 18-foot rowing sailing boat that was used as a tender on the steamboats. It was used by hunters and trappers and fishermen in their daily work. And it may have had something to do with the fact that it was December and there was 3 feet of snow on the ground. And I had never seen more than a dusting of snow in my life. But I got a little, I have to admit, I got a little homesick. And I stared at that page for a while and just decided this is what I need to do next. I need to build this Mississippi River yawl, this 1800s rowboat, and go home that way. That's how I need to go home when I finish my apprenticeship here.
Wow. So the idea of the river trip itself really started when you saw that boat in this old catalog.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. I mean, I had I had visions of building Mandy and I a small sailboat, or so I was kind of kicking around what I wanted to do because I was there for 2 years, and I was about a year into this program when I was thinking, what do I want to do after this? Work in the boat yards? We want to, talked about going down to the Caribbean. We talked about the kind of things that early 20-year-olds with no kids, no mortgage, and real romantic visions start to talk about. But when I saw the Mississippi River yawl, it was just apparent to me right away that I needed to do it. And so we set out building that exact boat.
So just tell us a little bit about the boat itself then, like a few of the dimensions, how long it took to
Sure.
construct it.
So it's a 18 feet long, and the beam, so the width of it at its widest point is about 4 foot 10 inches. It has two rowing stations, so it's four oars. There's room for two oarsmen, and there is a sail, but it's not a very big sail. And there's not even a rudder on this boat. So when you put the sail up, you steer the boat by taking one of the rowing oars and you stick it in a notch that's on the stern of the boat. And so you steer the boat with one of the oars. And there's a seat in the back at the stern, and there's a seat up in the bow. But once you put two people and a whole bunch of camping gear in there, there's not a whole lot of room to move about. But there's a similar boat called an Ohio River yawl, which is similar dimensions. It just has the oar locks are a little bit different on the Ohio River version. And in the museum there in Marietta, Ohio, they've actually built a couple of the Ohio River yawls. So I got to see some of those or some pictures of some of those, but there weren't any at the time that I knew of any Mississippi River yawl. So I was just going off of this picture and the dimensions in this book. And my wife and I built it. Took about a year and a half because I was a full-time apprentice at this apprentice shop. And so my instructor was fortunately, he caught into the idea. So he let me use his garage as an extra, there wasn't room in the boatyard. So I built it in his garage on nights and weekends. It took probably a year to a year and a half. And my wife sewed the sail and I did most of the woodwork. And then we both painted it. It was a labor of love for sure.
Wow.
And it's sitting in my backyard right now on a trailer. We still have it all these years later. That was we launched her in summer of 2000, just a couple of months before we started the actual river trip.
Wow. So how would that boat have typically been used in the 19th century?
So the trappers and the fishermen would use them, and I've heard that they were used as lifeboats on the steamboats, but they're also used as tenders. A lot of these the steamboats would come down river, and maybe if somebody wanted off the boat, they weren't going to actually land the steamboat at the bank. They would just put the passengers in there and row them to shore. While we were on the river, we met a fisherman, and he says to me, this guy's in this aluminum John boat over by the bank, and he said, "I recognize your boat." And it kind of startled me. And I was like, wait, what? How do you recognize my boat? And this was probably a 70-year-old man. And he said, my brother and I used to fish out of a yawl when we were kids. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, we would row up river all day, setting our lines out, trot lines or their nets or whatever. And then they would camp out at night. And then the next day they would float down and collect the catch and go sell them at the market and then do the whole thing over again, row back up river and row down river. And then I guess they sailed down river if there was a favorable wind, but you've been on the river, the winds, they kind of clock around a little bit. So um, the sail, we didn't use it nearly as often as we thought we were going to. In fact, I will say when we started the trip, I sort of had visions of just huck finning it. We were just going to use the oars to sort of stay out of the channel, and we were just going to float down the river. But in the summertime when you've got it may have been running 2 miles an hour that summer that we were on there, and the wind, got a headwind blowing out of the south, and so we ended up rowing, gosh, probably 8 hours a day. We rowed an awful lot, more of the time than I bargained for. We ended up rowing.
Right.
So
I mean, I think a lot of other folks discovered pretty quickly that a sail on the Mississippi really isn't much use. There aren't a lot of times you actually get to unfurl it and take advantage of the winds.
no, we only set the sail 2 times. Once the day that we left Burlington, it was just perfect. The wind coming over the stern, and it was a perfect day for it. And then we tried to hoist it in Dallas City, Illinois, and it was pretty apparent real quick there was way too much wind to have that kite up in the air like that. So we quickly pulled it down. And I will say the irony of ironies is that we got onto Lake Pepin, which is this nice huge expanse of water there, and I thought, well, this is going to be the place to set the sail, and there wasn't a breath of wind the whole day. So we ended up having to row Lake Pepin. But
Right. Normally people end up cursing Lake Pepin for too much wind. So,
yeah, and that's what we had been warned about. Like, it's going to get dangerous if the wind pipes up. It's a really dangerous place to be. And I mean, it was like rowing over, like the water looked like it had been lacquered. It was just completely glossy and calm. And I thought, well, this is unfair. This is unfair.
yeah, apparently somebody just wants you to get that exercise. So,
We got fit on that trip. I'll tell you that. That's a good weight loss routine, is to row 2,000 miles. You'll shed some pounds doing that.
I bet. And maybe I'll put that on my list for this summer. I could use losing a few.
Yeah, me
Uh,
too. Me too.
so 2002 then is when you started the trip. Is that right?
We did. Yeah. So we were, I built this boat thinking that we would do the whole river. Being somebody from Memphis, I thought, well, it's huge, and then I ordered all the maps and charts and stuff. And I got to look at a picture of the Mississippi where it first starts, which I had never seen before. And it was apparent very quickly that we were not going to put an 18-foot rowboat at the headwaters of the Mississippi. And so the compromise that we ended up coming up with was we borrowed a canoe to do that first 500 miles from Lake Itasca to Minneapolis. And, it was crazy for somebody from Memphis to think about fully uh, almost a quarter of the Mississippi, or no, it'd be 1/5, I guess, is above Minneapolis. Or I guess that's a quarter. It's 502 miles, I think, from Lake Itasca to St. Anthony Falls. And it was just astounding to me to think that much of the river is north of Minneapolis. But I had it in my mind that we were going to do the whole thing, and so I could not conceive of just starting the trip in Minneapolis. So we borrowed a canoe, did the first 500 miles, and then we swapped over to this rowboat, and that's when we started that portion of the trip. So the boat's name is Oxbow. We named her after the old the old river channels that are, have turned into lakes. But yeah, we spent 3 weeks in a canoe on the upper part we started in July of 2002. And then the plan was to be in the Gulf of Mexico by about Halloween. So we planned for it to be a 3 month trip, and it took 16 years. We
And
did.
we won't go into all of the spoilers about, how that trip got interrupted and all that. We will get to, I think, in a minute. I want to hear a little bit about that decision to end where you did the first
Sure.
time around. But I was just thinking too, like, so you said this boat is what, around 500 pounds or so, ox
Yeah,
boat?
500 pounds. So it's their pine planks on oak frames. It's all solid wood as it would have been built back then. And it's the day we launched it, it took 12 of us to carry the thing down to the water. I mean, she is not a Kevlar canoe. I mean, she is beefy. She's quite beefy.
Right. So trying to portage that boat around one of the dams up in northern Minnesota would have killed you right there anyway.
That's
So
that's it was not going to happen. But
yeah.
yeah, there's I don't remember how many dams there are north of Minneapolis, but there's quite a few times where you have to unload everything, carry the canoe around, reload it, and there was no way that was going to happen in a 500-pound boat, and the water's just so constricted up towards the headwaters region that it's no place for a boat with 9 foot oars. I mean, you just can't. It's not made for that.
Right. So, all right. So you had a canoe for the first portion, and then at Minneapolis, you were able to get an oxbow and get going. What was that first day like?
Oh, it was I would say luxurious because you get out of a canoe and then you get into a rowboat that's almost 5 feet wide, and all of a sudden you've got all of this room. So it was spacious. But the other thing is that was the first real city, I guess, that we were kind of going through. St. Paul, there's all those gosh, I don't even know what it is, gravel and grain and all those facilities on the side of the river there. And the difference between a rowboat and a canoe is you're looking backwards in a rowboat. And so it was a little daunting, I would say, heading into all of that industry when we were looking the other way. And so the first day in the rowboat, Mandy actually sat facing forward. She sort of called out directions to sort of, there's a towboat heading upriver, and head off this way, head off that way. But after the first day, we sort of got comfortable looking over our shoulder and sort of gauging the closing speed of some of the barges and stuff, and got a little more comfortable with it. And I would say within a couple of days, we were clicking like a metronome. It was pretty. We got in time pretty good, and it. I love canoeing, but I really love rowing. I just like the sway of the motion. It was fun. I was glad to be in the rowboat. I'll say that.
Yeah. Because that is one of the challenges. I mean, it's certainly like the barge traffic and the recreational boat traffic can be daunting enough in a canoe and trying to dodge all of that, but you typically see what's coming. And so you had to train yourself to look over your shoulder pretty regularly. And
Yeah, every couple of dozen strokes or whatever, we would look over our shoulder. But I guess the flip side of that is if you're in a canoe, you really don't have a sense of what's bearing down behind you, and the barges that are coming downriver can be moving quite a bit faster. So I guess being in a canoe, you've got to look over your shoulder too to see what's heading downriver.
absolutely, there are plenty of stories about people in canoes who were surprised at how quickly a barge snuck up on them. Because they can be surprisingly quiet too when they're behind you.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And all of that when the wind is blowing in your ears, man, it's hard to hear those things. So we kept an eye out. But the other thing is the boat only draws probably 4 or 5 inches of water, even when it was loaded with all of our gear. So we did generally try and stay, I wouldn't, either to the side of the channel or out of the channel completely. I don't know that there were many days that we were running the middle of the channel there, even though you get most of the current there. It seems like we tried to sort of skirt the channel a little bit.
In that part of the river, when you get past St. Paul and like down toward Dubuque and the Quad Cities, there are quite a few side channels. Like, did you wander away from the main channel in time to explore
Oh,
some of the back channels?
yeah, every chance we could. I love that part of it. Just it just seemed like a door to another place. You know, this little side channel. It would just veer off into the wilderness. It looks like, and you just sort of take that side route, and there's no barges, there's no people. It's just wildlife everywhere, and it's surprisingly quiet, and it's just yeah. If I could have done the whole river in those, those side channels, I probably would have done that. Yeah, we would do that sometime, camp back in there when we could find a sandy place. Yeah, I mean, I think that those, um, man, it's they're just such a treasure that those are just all of these undeveloped islands back in there, and all those braided channels that sort of, you know, are off on the sides there. I love that, and I love the bluffs. You know, being a kid from Memphis, you just think, I mean, Memphis is on a bluff, but it's not. It doesn't compare to the driftless area or the you know, the hills that are along the river right there. That was a pretty shocking sight for me in a good way. I thought it was beautiful. I love the Upper Mississippi, and I knew nothing about it until we did it.
That's one of the things that I enjoyed with your book too, is there are so many of these parts of the river that it was your first time seeing them, and it was fun to sort of experience that first time through your eyes and through your writing. So I appreciated that a lot about the book.
Yeah, yeah. We got to, you know, when we did this, it was 2000, so there was no YouTube, so we couldn't watch any videos on it. The only There was no Facebook, so there was no like paddlers group or anything like that. The only thing I had read about someone doing the river was Old Glory by Jonathan Reban.
Yep.
That was the only book that I had read about about a river trip before we did it. And other than that, I didn't know anything about. We just sort of went into it blind, which I think was kind of it was. You know, there was a steep learning curve, but I had no preconceived notions about what it was going to be. It was every day was new to me.
Hey, Dean Klinkenberg here, interrupting myself. Just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that is set in places along the Mississippi. My newest book, The Wild Mississippi, goes deep into the world of Old Man River. Learn about the varied and complex ecosystems supported by the Mississippi, the plant and animal life that depends on them, and where you can go to experience it all. Find any of these wherever books are sold. And I was curious about that because now there's so much information available. There is the Facebook Paddlers page. There are other books out there.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I feel like people are over preparing for the trip, and maybe I wonder if they're losing that openness to newness and novelty and wonder by over preparing for everything. Do you have any thoughts on that, or what
Yeah,
was it like for you?
I've had the exact same thought, and you know, those paddlers groups that are on Facebook, and I'm a member of some of them. I think they're a great asset for people. They can help people, assist people when they're in trouble. I do think that there might be it can invite you to, like you said, prepare too much, read too much, and you can end up in this like paralysis by analysis where you try and like, you know, plan out where all you're going to camp and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we would start looking for a camping spot about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and as soon as we saw one, we would stop. There was no you know, and God bless the river angels that help people. I think it's super cool. But like I said, I think that there you can come to a point where you rely on that stuff too much, and it becomes a if you have an itinerary, I guess, I think that sort of strips some of the magic, for lack of a better word, or it can strip away some of the magic from a trip like that. Because part of what's part of what's sort of life changing about these, not just this trip, but these kinds of trips, are you not only learn so much about yourself, but you learn so much about an area that you knew nothing about and didn't over prepare for, and didn't look at pictures and YouTube videos of every step of the way. You just sort of got out there on the water and trusted that it was going to work out, and
Right.
it does most of the time.
Well, you got a book out of it, so I mean, you did finish it. So like, obviously you did a few things right. Um, so for you then, yeah, what were some of the core, like the most important preps or preparations that you took before you started the trip? Like when you think back on it now, um, what was your approach to preparing for it?
What did we do? Well, as far as preparing for it, we didn't do any sort of training. I will say that the day we launched our rowboat, which again was just a couple of weeks, maybe a month before the trip, I think I had rowed one boat in my life, and Mandy had never rowed. And so that little maiden voyage around the harbor there in Rockland was, it was a comedy of clattering oars because we couldn't get into time together, and so there wasn't any physical training. As far as preparing for it, we had both camped before, but never done any kind of river trip, in a canoe or otherwise. And so I think we bought a dry bag, and got a bunch of camping stuff from the local camping store, and we kind of brought along what we thought we should bring. There's a couple things looking back on it that I'm like, we brought one of those water purifying straws. We never ended up using that because there's enough places to stop and fill up. We have jerry cans. Each of them was 5 gallons, so we're carrying 10 gallons of fresh water. We never had to drink out of a mud puddle or anything like that. And we brought a compass. I don't know why we didn't need the compass. But yeah, just mostly just camping stuff is what we brought. Camping stuff, and a just some audacity and very, very little skill. And
But also you brought, I presume, some sense of confidence that you'd be able to figure things out along the way too.
yeah, we had done some camping before, but this was definitely a test for us because it was more what I would call backcountry camping than we had ever done before. I mean, we had car camped, and done that kind of stuff, and yeah, it takes a little maybe bravado, or maybe uh, just some ignorant confidence, I guess. I don't know. We just felt like it would work out.
Right.
You can't, yeah, we just didn't want to plan too much. And I will say that goes for most things in our lives, is just try not to plan too much and just do it.
So it's not specific to a river trip in your case, and it's just kind of a life philosophy maybe.
Yeah, yeah. I would say to the much to the dismay of my in-laws and sometimes my parents. Yeah, we just sort of go for it
Yeah.
sometimes.
So what was the rhythm like from day to day then once you got going in Oxbow? Was there a certain kind of pattern that you got into day to day or
Yeah, we I think when it was all said and done, we averaged about 30 miles a day. Like I said, we were rowing probably 8 hours a day. We'd wake up in the morning, have coffee and breakfast on the sandbar until we realized we could just get in the boat and actually make some miles while we're doing this. So then we started just eating breakfast in the boat while we floated. And then we'd row for several hours and just sort of fall into that sort of like trance like state that you can fall into when you just get into this rhythm. Like I said, we were moving like a metronome, so it was just, you could kind of get lulled into this uh just sense of otherworldly whatever. It's like you just sort of, the time just passes. And then we would always stop for lunch and then try and pick out we try and pin down where we were on the chart and then find a spot um downriver, and we would just float for 60 minutes and see if we could get to that point. and then that's how we would determine how quickly the river was going. If we started eating lunch at this bridge right here, and we're rounding this point, 60 minutes later, and we're not rowing, and that point was 2.5 miles away, well, then the river's going 2.5 miles an hour. So that was sort of our daily thing to sort of figure out how fast the river was going, was to float for at least 60 minutes a day and see how far the river would take us. And then, like I said, late afternoon, we'd start looking for sandbars, which again, that was another thing, that not knowing what to expect. Um, I think that I anticipated camping in the mud a whole lot more than we did, because you just think of, the muddy Mississippi and the muddy riverbanks. And if you in Memphis, if you go down to the riverbank, it's mud and rocks, and it's not real pleasant. But then being actually out on the river, I was just astounded at how many beach like sandbars there are. And so about 5 o'clock, we would just start looking for an ideal spot to camp, and sometimes you'd find them, and sometimes you wouldn't. Sometimes you'd end up on a like on a low sandbar, and worry that if the river was rising, that you might get swallowed up in the night. And that came close to happening more than once. But yeah, that was sort of our rhythm of things. And yeah, you're just kind of you're just rising and falling with the sun. There's no. I love That's what I love about camping, is just sort of you get into the rhythm of sort of the celestial rhythm, instead of like artificial lights and television shows and those kind of things that could keep you up past midnight. It just that doesn't happen so often on the river.
Right. Well, and in that time of year, you've got long days too, especially up in Minnesota when you started. It might be
Yes.
11 o'clock before it's fully dark, and then it's light pretty early. And
Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
I do remember when we were in Minnesota, we bummed a ride to Walmart because um, we didn't know that it got cool at night. And
yeah,
so all we had was shorts and t-shirts, and it would get down to, it gets down to 55 degrees, 60 degrees at night. And so we ended up bumming a ride to Walmart to get a sweatshirt in northern Minnesota, because that was another surprise, was just how cool it gets up there, even during the summertime at night.
yeah. I lived in Minnesota for a few years, and I still got surprised by that. I did just a couple day paddle around the headwaters in August,
Okay.
and when I woke up my first morning, it was in the low 40s. I wasn't fully prepared for that myself, so.
No, no, it's not supposed to be that way.
No, but up there, it's kind of normal. So, one of the things that I like with the book too is that you obviously have a big interest in history,
Mm-hmm.
and there are lots of places throughout the book where you write a little bit about some of the history of the places as you're passing them. Were you sort of aware of those things when you were paddling down the river? Were you thinking about, oh, this is where this happened, or this is where X, Y, or Z happened? Were you kind of cognizant of the river history as you're paddling down or
A,
rowing
a,
down?
a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, because there was room enough in our boat where we carried a whole bunch of books. And so, as we were going down river, I remember reading. We read Undaunted Courage, and so that whole scene about them going up the Missouri River, and the Corps of Engineer camping across the Mississippi from the mouth of the Missouri, those sort of things. And I did have a couple of just history of the Mississippi Valley books with me, and then some of that was just information I'd held on to over the years. In Memphis, I would always sort of read about Mississippi River history. It just always had as I said earlier, if I get interested in something, I just sort of get attached to not only that thing, but the history of that thing and the history of its history. And so when I first got interested in the Mississippi, when I was working on those river boats, the sightseeing paddle boats in Memphis, I remember reading some history of the Mississippi, just trying to just sort of taking in all the stuff that sort of had happened around, like the wreck of the Sultana, all of the incredible depth of history, a lot of it which is literally buried Yeah, I had read a lot of that stuff over the years. But then after the trip, I also went back and read, because we would pass some place and I would be like, man, this something happened here. There's some ruins here, or this place has an interesting name, and then I would go back and read it. In fact, there's a book called Historic Names and Places on the Lower Mississippi River, and it was put out by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1970s. And it's a pretty incredible book because it gives you'll be rounding some point that has some name, whatever bend or whatever point. And this book, Historic Names and Places on the Lower Mississippi River, it gives the history of all those names and why this is called this bend and why this is that point. And those sort of things just fascinate me because those are what we have left to kind of tell the story of the river that's there today, is the names that we attach to all those places.
Right. Somebody probably needs to do that book for the upper part of the river too, then.
Yeah, I know a guy.
Uh, Interesting. All right, so 2002 then, your expectation is going to be a source to sea trip,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of started taking a beating by the time you got to Baton Rouge, especially, and
Yeah.
made a decision to stop the trip and get off the river at New Orleans.
Yep.
Can you just tell a little bit about what was going on at that time, why you changed your mind about going on to the Gulf?
Yeah, we I mean, as late as Natchez, we were still intending on going the whole way. But anybody that's been on the Mississippi, especially anyone who's um, started north of Louisiana at any point, and has seen how beautiful it is through there, and then gone through Baton Rouge, it really it changes dramatically. Like I say in the book, it feels like a set change. It's like all of a sudden there's this incredible industry with these refineries, chemical plants, and all this stuff that's on the river, on the banks of the river. But not only those industries, the attendant ships that come upriver to feed those refineries. Um, they I mean, if you think it's daunting to be on the river with a towboat, pushing 42 barges, when you're on the river with a boat that's 1,000 feet long and standing something like 6 stories in the air, you're invisible. If you're in a rowboat or a canoe or a kayak, you're invisible. And we had our share of ships honking at us. We had our share of longshoremen on the docks yelling at us to get the hell away from the banks. Don't come between this towboat and this dock. And what are you doing down here? And are you trying to get yourself killed? And all that kind of stuff. And on top of that, it had been raining for probably 2 weeks straight. And some of our clothes were starting to get a little moldy. And it just felt like I don't know, it just felt like the joy of the thing was sort of uh, dissolving. And we met a ship pilot who told us point blank, "You are absolutely crazy if you continue going past New Orleans. The traffic doesn't get any lighter. In fact, it gets heavier." And he sort of really read us the riot act about trying to do what we were doing. And I think that coupled with the fact that it had sort of lost its fun when we got to New Orleans, it sort of felt like, well, this is a fitting finish line. New Orleans is a party city, it's a celebratory city. This seems like a good place to end it. If we're not going to go to the Gulf, this seems like a good place to end it. And so at the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal, we left the Mississippi and rode into Lake Pontchartrain and called some family in Tennessee, and we hauled the boat out of the river 90, 100 miles short of the Gulf, about 3 months after we had started in that summer of 2002.
Right. I kind of what crossed my mind reading about that particular stage too is that it seemed like for so much of the trip, like even if you had a hard day, you had the beauty of the river around you, and maybe that helped kind of refill the tank a little bit from day to day having that. But by the time you got to Baton Rouge, it was just a slog, and you're kind of constantly under assault, and maybe you just didn't have those moments of the river beauty to refill your tank enough to find the will to keep going.
Yeah, yeah, that is precisely how it felt. It was like at the end of the day, instead of instead of like taking in the sunset and just really enjoying how beautiful the river was, at the end of the day, our thoughts were like, how many more days do we have to do this? How many more days? It was just, yeah, we were sort of worn down by the time we'd run that gauntlet from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, which is why a lot of people nowadays I think go the Chafalaya out that way, which I would love to do one day. But that particular trip, we were married to the Mississippi, so we stayed on the river
Right.
until then. Yeah,
And I just like the my own editorializing here. River pilots always say you're crazy for being out on the river in a
they
canoe
do.
or small boat. They act like sometimes they act like they own the river and anybody else doesn't belong there.
Yes.
It's baloney. Like there's plenty of room for everybody, even
Yeah.
those of us in
Yeah.
small boats.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I think at that time, I think that him telling us were crazy to go on was sort of giving, if I'm thinking back on it, I think that that was giving me license to say, okay, this is far enough, you know, because I had his I had his authoritative opinion telling me you can't do it. And so that gave me the ability to tell myself, okay, we can't do it. We should get out right here. New Orleans is a good place to stop.
Yeah.
So we did.
So it's one of those interesting life moments, isn't it? Because at that point in time, it felt like that was the right thing to do to stop the trip. But the decision kind of ultimately didn't sit so well with you. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, when we finished it or when we got to New Orleans, I was like I said, I had told myself I was satisfied that I didn't have anything more to prove. But then it started to, for some reason, it started to kind of wear on me in the following years that we just had never seen it. Had never seen the end. I'd come across some picture of Port Eads. I'd see some map of Louisiana and that hand reaching out into the Gulf. It was like, I always wanted to see it, and I never got a chance to get down there and see it. And it kind of wore on me for a little while. And then, so we did that trip in 2002. I was in my 20s. Well, fast forward, 15 years later or whatever, I turned 40 years old and I had an office job by this time. I had a woodworking business. And when the economy sort of stuttered for a while there, I went back to school and I started working at an architecture firm. So I was a cubicle guy doing CAD drawings, and I was in a place that I never thought that I would be. The whole reason I left school was I didn't want to get a job where I sat inside, doing that sort of thing. And here I was with an office job, two kids, a mortgage, a car payment, and then I turned 40. And it sort of felt like the way I explained it to my wife was that it just felt like the levee broke, and I started really struggling with anxiety and some panic attacks, and really just this overwhelming existential dread that I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing, or I wasn't doing what I was meant to do, or however you want to phrase it. It just made my life sort of an emotional hell there for a little while. And I started seeing this therapist to kind of talk through it a little bit. And I remember him asking me, he's like, what do you think it is that you really want? And what I wanted, I think at that time more than anything, was just to kind of reconnect with who I saw myself as which was someone who was creative, built things, did things. I wanted to sort of be an adventurer again. I felt like my life had stalled out, and a few weeks into being 40, I just couldn't live with the idea that that was going to be my life until retirement. Was that I had sort of uh, that I had sort of given in to this life. And so I told him I want to go back. I want to go finish the river. And we still had the boat. The boat had been sitting in the side yard for 15 years. But the thing about a wooden boat is if it's not in the water, it's not good for the boat. You take a wooden boat and just put it out in the side yard. It's not going to last very long. And so I had discussed it with my wife, and she told me, I'm fine with where we stopped it in New Orleans, but if you need to go back, I totally understand. I see what you're going through. If that's what it takes, then let's do it. And then I said, I want to take the kids. And she said, you're crazy.
And how
And
old were the kids at that time then?
at that time, they would have been, I think, 9 and 11. So this was in 2018. So they were 9 and 11 at the time. And she agreed that they could go as long as we didn't camp out on, like, we weren't trespassing anywhere or anything like that. So I pulled the boat into the garage because we needed to paint it. The paint was all chipping off and stuff. So I pulled the boat into the garage to repaint it and kind of get it ready, oil it, just spruce it up a little bit. And that was when I realized that the entire bottom was rotten off. I could put my hand through the bottom. I could just peel away the wood. And I realized I was going to have to rebuild it. And so my kids helped me rebuild the boat, which was sort of, it was a surreal experience for me because at 9 and 11, they were closer to the age that I was when I initially built the boat when I was 22 than I was then at 40, 41. They were closer to that age. So the two of them helped me rebuild the boat. And Labor Day weekend of 2018, we put the boat back in the river exactly where Mandy and I took it out 16 years prior.
Fantastic. Now, as much as I would love to have you tell the stories about the what it was like to go back out there and finish it, I think people should read the book and find out for themselves some of the obstacles you ran into and what you had to go through to finally finish that trip. But you did get there. You did finally get Oxbow to the salt water of the Gulf of Mexico.
We did. We did. There were days I didn't think it was going to happen, but we did. We did.
Tell us about that moment a little bit.
Yeah, I think in the book I describe it as, I remember my wife asking me, "How do you feel?" Because she was doing the trip for me. She, like she said, she was okay with, she'd made peace with where we ended it years ago. She didn't need to go back. And so she was sort of observing me at that moment. And I remember her asking me, "How do you feel?" And I felt like I could either double over crying or that I could just burst out laughing. It was just the most chaotic swirl of emotions. It's something that I thought that I would have done in my 20s. And here I was in my 40s and in the same boat with the same girl, and just a lot less hair on top of my head, I guess. But we got there, and it really was a dream come true. I mean, I know that I know that phrase gets tossed around a lot, but it really was yeah, it really was a dream come true.
So, I know I sometimes like chide reporters for asking that question. Well, how do you feel now that you've done X, Y, or Z? So I don't want to go too deep into that, but I am curious, like part of why you wanted to finish this
Mm-hmm.
was to reconnect with that part of yourself,
Yeah.
that freedom, that sense of freedom and adventure. So what's life been like since you finished this trip?
Well, so I left the architecture firm that I was working at. So I no longer work indoors, or in an office, I should say. I reopened my woodworking business. So I do custom furniture and I do trim carpentry. Um, I played music for years, but while I was working in the office, I had hung up my guitars and I didn't really play much of any music. But since we finished the river, I put out another record in 2020. Um, Actually, a few weeks before COVID, which is a great time to put out a record when all all, all my shows got canceled. But yeah, so we put out a record called Blood in the Honey, and there's actually a song on there called "Oh Saint Dymphna" that is not about the rowboat trip, but it's about dealing with. It does mention a rowboat in there, and Saint Dymphna is the patron saint of um, not mental disorders, but like anxiety, depression. She's the patron saint of that. And so the song is called "Oh Saint Dymphna," and that's a song about sort of reconnecting with the river. And the song mentions Saint Dymphna in a rowboat. But I've been playing music. Another cool river thing that we've done, and this is an incomplete project at the moment, but my daughter and we got a 360 camera, one of those like Google Street cameras, and we rigged it up on our canoe. And the local river that runs through our part of Tennessee is called the Harpeth River, and it's a 115-mile river that empties into the Cumberland. And so we did the entire river with a 360 camera. And if I was more adept with IT stuff, it would already be online. But I have tens of thousands of 360 photos that I am trying to get put up onto Google Maps, so you'll eventually be able to like drop a pin on the Harpeth River and it will take you down to a 360 view. And just like you could travel any street in America through Google Maps, you will eventually be able to travel the Harpeth River. And there are people that have done sections of the Mississippi like that. So if you go to the headwaters region of the Mississippi, you can drop a pin anywhere on the river and it will take you to a street view of the river.
Wow.
Which, if we'd had that back in the day, I never would have thought that I would have known better than to think that a rowboat could be put in the water up there.
Right. Well, that's great. I mean, it's a little reassuring to me. Like what I like about what you just described too is like, you had this larger personal purpose for getting back out to finish this trip. And a lot of times I think people expect this to be some kind of silver bullet that's going to fix everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't fix everything, but it sounds like it really sort of helped you refine your way.
Yeah, it definitely it helped kind of jumpstart some of those things that had been dormant in me, because I've always sort of had that sort of creative vigor, and the vigor was gone, but I think I still had like there was still it helped to kind of reignite that creative spark that I sort of always saw myself as having. So yeah, I don't think it was a silver bullet, but it absolutely was a catalyst for doing some other creative things that I've done since then. Yeah.
I don't know if you've had much chance to think about this particular aspect of it, but what is there about a river trip like that sort of um, almost begs for self-examination and for those moments of personal transformation?
I th- I think part of it is uh, just the time that you have out there, the time and the quietness. I mean, you can't paddle a canoe or row a boat and scroll social media at the same time. So you really don't have anything to distract you other than your own thoughts and your surroundings. And so if you're any sort of introspective person, I just think it's natural that you're going to start asking larger questions about your life when you're out there. But I think that the time that you have and just the space, you have to cover so much space. And when in our day-to-day world now, we're commuting 30 miles to go to school or to go to work or whatever. And when you're on the river, I mean, 30 miles that's a day. And so just the time and the space, everything sort of breathes a little more out there, I think. Yeah.
Hmm. Great. Now, I wanted to ask you about this too. I think in the book near the end, you wrote a little bit how you preferred, say, let's call them the flatter, wetter landscapes over the mountains.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've got so I grew up in Memphis, and my best friend since the first grade. We're still in close contact with one another, and he's one of these guys that he took off from Montana at some point with a backpack and just kind of fell in love with the Rocky Mountains, and he's just always waxing poetic about how beautiful the Rocky Mountains are and all of the summits out there. But I'm the opposite. I want the lower place. I want the swampy kind of lowlands. I just think that there's this I don't know if the understated beauty is there's a more subtle beauty to it to me. When you're in a mountainous sort of landscape, you can see these proud peaks from miles and miles and miles away. But if you're in the bayous or in some wetlands, it takes a little bit of work to get to a sort of like hidden. There's little places that are hidden in the mountains. It's like nothing's hidden. It's all right there on the skyline. You can see everything. And I just I like the slow, languid waters and just the wildlife and just the smell. I just love everything about wetlands and low places. That's where it's at for me.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And I think one of the things you may have written in the book too is just the idea that they're the kind of places that you get rewarded for paying attention. Like with the mountains, they're big, they're hard to miss, right? But when
Right.
you're in a prairie, when you're in the wetlands, it can look pretty similar off
Mm-hmm.
to the horizon, but
Right.
the beauty is really in the details, and you've got to slow down and look around to really appreciate all of the beauty within.
Yes. Yes. You've got to pay attention. I think the line in the book is um, that it rewards the watchful and the willing, because you do, like you said, you've got to work for it, and you've got to really just slow everything down and pay attention, because like you said, at first glance it all looks the same, but there's just something special around every bend.
Tell us a little bit about the book then. Crooked Old River. When is it going to be available and where can people find a copy?
Yeah, so Crooked Old River, it's going to be coming out April 13th, and it will obviously be on Amazon like every book, or you can get it through my website, which is just trapperhaskins.com, and under the store tab, it will be there. I will say, being a songwriter, I've written 3-minute songs my whole life. And so writing a nearly a 300-page book, I thought, well, this is going to flex those same muscles, and how long could it possibly take? And so this being my first book, I really thought it was going to take about 2 years, but it took 4 years to write and then another year to edit. And I know you as an author understand that the endurance sport that is writing. That was sort of a lesson for me. But it's done now. It's been edited, and the cover of the book is a photograph that was taken of us on the river by a couple that was doing the Great Loop, which is down the Mississippi around the Gulf Coast and East Coast, through the canals and into the Great Lakes. Anyhow, this couple was doing the Great Loop, and we were talking, and they were taking pictures of us. And we still had our apartment in Maine, and so they hollered, "What's your address?" before they motored off, and we told them. And when we got home to Maine, that picture was waiting in our mail pile. So that's the cover of the book was taken by another couple that was doing a trip down the river
People on the river are happy to give.
all the time.
Fantastic. And I would assume like if people buy directly through your website, then it's a little better deal for you than if they buy it through Amazon.
Yeah, so it's the same. It's 1995, so it's the same price through Amazon or on my website. But the ones through me, it's a better deal for me, and those are signed copies. The ones that come from trapperhaskins.com.
All right, I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Okay.
Are you active in any social media channels? Any place people can follow your work more regularly?
Yep. On Instagram, Twitter, X, whatever you call it, Facebook. I'm just at Trapper Haskins anywhere online. I do have a YouTube channel where that's generally music, and I'm not nearly as active as I should be on there, but you can find me on there too. But yeah, everywhere it's just Trapper Haskins, Haskins.
All right. Links in the show notes. Check there, folks. Uh, Trapper, thank you so much for taking the time today. We went a little longer than 45 minutes as I thought we might, but I really appreciate your time and I really enjoyed your book.
Well, thank you so much. As a regular listener to your show, it is honestly it's a huge honor to be on your show. So I appreciate you having me.
And now it's time for the Mississippi Minute. Well, goodness, this is gonna be a good year for Mississippi River themed books. There are a couple of books out already, and more coming this spring and into the summer. Two novels that are out already that have been attracting a lot of attention. One is called James by Percival Everett, a novel that retells the story of Huck Finn from the perspective of Jim. So I'm really looking forward to digging into that one. A novel that I just started reading that's only recently been released is called Cahokia Jazz by Francis Spufford. Not sure exactly how to pronounce his name. From the book description, it is a, quote, noirish detective novel set in the 1920s that reimagines how American history would be different if, instead of being decimated, indigenous populations had thrived. This novel is set in the place we call Cahokia, that today we treat as an archaeological site, but in the novel treats it as very much a live city. In the podcast, I interviewed Trapper Haskins about his book, Crooked Old River. That book is coming out on April 13th, 2024, and may already have been released by the time you listen to this episode. My book, The Wild Mississippi, a state-by-state guide to the river's natural wonders, releases on May 21. I'll have more to say about that in the next episode of this podcast. Virginia Hanesick has a book coming out called Into the Quiet and the Light, Water, Life, and Land Loss in South Louisiana. She's a photographer who focuses on architecture of water and land, and this particular book focuses on what's happening down in South Louisiana. Looking forward to reading that book and looking at her amazing photographs. And Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi by Boyce Upholt releases on June 11th. A sweeping environmental history of the river, which has already been very well reviewed. So Boyce is also offering a Mississippi River party pack of snacks and drinks from Mississippi River towns to anyone who purchases or pre-orders his book, plus at least one other of these Mississippi River themed books that release in 2024. Go to his website for details on how that's going to work. So I'd love to know what you think of these books as you have a chance to read them yourself. Drop me a note at MississippiValleyTraveler.com/contact and let me know what you think about these books. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by No Offense. See you next time.